Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm. In this video, we're going to explore the concept of prefabricated objects. And in this video, we're really going to expand our ability to quickly make new things in our game and then kind of make copies of them, right? So let's think about our spike here for just a second. We have our Mr. Spike, and he has a collider around him, and he's tagged as an enemy. He's essentially set up exactly like we want him to be set up. Now, what we could do is we could make another Spike by bringing in the sprite, and we can plop him in wherever, and then we can do all kinds of stuff like that, right? I'm going to get rid of this. You don't need that yet. But I can bring in my sprite. I could tag him as an enemy, I could add the collider and all of that stuff. But that's going to take quite a while. So let's just go ahead and delete him, because what we want to do is something that actually is going to save us a lot of time. What we can do is we can say this is a prefabricated object, meaning it has everything that it needs on it, and all we have to do is basically create a copy of this that we can then put in wherever we want. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it Prefabs. Let's go ahead and open up that folder. Now, any object that we drop into this folder, this Prefabs folder, it could be any folder. We could just drop it into assets if we wanted to, but any object we drop into our assets folder or Prefabs folder or whatever, it's going to create a copy of that object. And then we can then use that prefab to kind of create whatever we want. So I'm going to drag my spike down here, and I'm going to drop it into prefabs. Now, a couple things happened just now. First, it created a version of my spike in my folder, and the spike object turned blue in the hierarchy. There's this little arrow next to it. If I click that, then it'll open up the edit mode for the prefab, and I can do all kinds of things to the prefab. If we click this little arrow back here, we'll go back to our full project. If I click on the sprite, I can see over here, or on the spike object, sorry, we can see over here in the inspector that some things look a little bit different. First of all, we have these prefab options down here, but everything else is the same. Right? So it still has its sprite renderer, its edge collider, all of that stuff. Now what I can do is I can just take copies of this sprite, or of this spike, sorry, and just drag them out into the scene and just kind of drop them wherever I think it would make sense for a spike to be. And then I can rotate them here on my Z-axis. Let's rotate it there. Let's do exactly -90, so it's facing that way, and I could just keep dragging out spikes all day long. 180 on the Z, and put that one 180 on the Z. I notice that all of these are now prefabbed versions or prefabricated versions of that spike, which means they all have the collider and the renderer. So now if I were to collide with any of these spikes, let's go ahead and let my game load. If I were to collide with any of these spikes, I would actually reset the level. So let's skip over those two. Let's collide with this one. And it does, right? So these all work exactly how they're supposed to. Now, some of you who maybe have some experience with Unity, or maybe if you've just been playing around with the features in Unity, know that we could actually just duplicate. If I Control D, I can duplicate versions of this spike and bring it out and then put it wherever I want, and that's great. The power of a prefab, though, is that because it's prefabricated object, if I edit this prefab, for example, if I turn off this edge collider, let's turn back. If I go into open prefab, sorry, and turn off the edge collider, when I go back into my game, none of my spikes have their collider on now, which means I can bump into them willy-nilly and I don't have to worry about resetting the level. Now that's not the functionality we want, so I'm just going to click Edge Collider 2D on one of these, and then I can go Overrides and Apply All. And that will make that change to every single prefab in my level. So that's why prefabrication is often the best idea if you want to duplicate objects. If we were just to create a spike and then duplicate it over and over again without it being a prefabricated object, then I wouldn't be able to make a change that applies to all of the versions of that object very quickly. Okay. Just put another spike like right there. Now, if I was building this game so it was an actual production game, I'd probably want to put a bunch of spikes in here and make the game a lot more challenging. But I actually just want to talk about prefabs in this, and we can spend more time playing around with the level design to make it more interesting. But I just want some more spikes in here. Okay, so that's the power of a prefab when duplicating objects. But what about if we have an object that doesn't exist in our game from the start, but we want it to show up? So think about it like this. Let's say we have a game, a shooter game, right? And we have a bullet. We want to be able to fire a bullet out of a gun or out of the spaceship or out of a whatever. And we want that bullet to fly in a direction, and if it collides with something, it destroys that object or takes away some hit points or whatever, right? Well, we don't want the bullet to exist until we tell it to. So that's where another instance where prefabs are really, really helpful. So I thought in our game that we're building, it doesn't really make sense to make a shooting mechanic for our ghost here. But let's say the ghost kind of wants to figure out where he was, and he wants to leave little breadcrumbs, like little blobs of ectoplasm wherever he went, right? Now, at some point, we could limit the amount of these ectoplasm blobs that he has, and we can actually give them a glow or something. My idea for this game might not pan out, but I'm thinking at some point we might want to create a lighting effect around him, and so we can't see everything in the level, but those ectoplasms will light up and then leave a permanent light source, right? But for now, let's just build in the functionality where we lay these blobs of ectoplasm. So I'm going to go into my sprites, and I'm going to bring in one of those blobs. Let's go to my desktop. Okay, and I have this blob sprite that I've created in Photoshop. It's not the best looking thing, but it is a blob, right? 16 pixels per unit. Let's turn off the filter, and let's turn off the compression and hit apply. Now we can drag our blob object out into the world. I don't like the way it looks right away. I do want to shrink it down. So 0.5 on the X, 0.5 on the Y, and let's play with this rotation to see if we can find a rotation value that looks a lot better. I think that looks good. Now, if you didn't notice what I did, I clicked on the Z and I just dragged back and forth. And notice it's wrapping around the screen. But that is a quick way for you to fine-tune stuff in Unity. All right, so we have our blob here. Let's zoom in on it. Now, this blob for now doesn't need anything, right? We're not going to add anything to it. The only thing that we actually need for this blob is a rigid body. And the reason why is because the code that we're going to write is actually specifically looking for a rigid body so that it can figure out where the blob goes in 3D space. So I'm going to click a rigid body 2D and add that to my blob here. All right. And should we do... Nah, we're not going to write the script for rotation. I was thinking about rotating these things after you lay them, so they kind of slowly rotate, but we don't really need to do that this week at least. We can do that another week. Or not at all. Who knows? Okay, so I think that's all we need to do. We do need to turn off gravity scale, though. I don't want this to fall through the level. Now, we do not need a collider around this blob because I don't want my ghosts to bump into them and push them around. I want them to just kind of exist in the level wherever he sets them down. Okay, now, I think our blob is set up properly, exactly with what we need. So let's make it into a prefab. So I'll drag this blob object down into my prefabs folder, and let's actually delete the blob out of our game because we don't want a blob there to begin with. And now we have to modify our script, right? So what we have to do is tell our script that whenever we press a button, we want that blob to show up. So first, we need a public variable. This one's going to be a public rigid body 2D. So we're going to grab the rigid body of that blob, and we'll just call this blob. So we need a public rigid body 2D for the blob, basically so we can get its position values. Now, we want to constantly check for this button press. We want to check for it every frame, so we're going to do it with an update. So underneath our player.velocity stuff here, I'm going to say if input.getKeyDown, that's going to get an input key, just a key on our keyboard, and we'll give it the key code of space. So if we press the space bar, so all this code really just means is if we press the space bar, then we want to do something very specific for prefabs. When we create a new version of a prefab within a game, it's called instantiation. So we're going to instantiate a version of that prefab. So I'll say instantiate. Now the first argument that goes into this instantiate method is the prefab itself. Now notice that because Visual Studio is really smart, it can already kind of tell, hey, you have some prefabs here. Do you want to instantiate the blob rigid body that you've created up here? And that's actually what I want. I want the blob rigid body to instantiate. Now think about what would happen if I instantiated, let's say, the player instead. Well, then I would have another ghost in my game, and that ghost would be moving around and everything else because that ghost, the second ghost, the copy ghost, would also have the script. And then if I push the space bar again, it would create two copies because the first ghost would create a copy, and then the second ghost that we just created would create another copy, and so on and so forth. It would be a problem, right? So we're just going to instantiate our blob. And then, okay, so the second argument in here is going to be where should the blob instantiate? And I essentially want the blob to show up wherever my player is, right? Because I want it to like come out from the player. Now, believe it or not, that's all the code we need. Basically, if I push the space bar, I want to instantiate a prefab where my player is standing. I'm going to go ahead and click Attach to Unity. And let's go back to Unity and let it update itself. And then let's grab our ghost. And if we look here, we have another public object or a public variable. This one's looking for a rigid body. If we drag our blob prefab and drop it right in there, then that's basically assigning this prefab to that rigid body blob object within my script. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out. Okay, so I'm moving around. Let's say I want to drop a blob right here. If I push the space bar, the blob is going off to the left of my character. So that's weird. I wonder why that's happening. Well, let's explore. If we take a look at our blob here, notice that its positional values are way, way off, right? It's at negative 3.37 on the X, and it's at positive 0.177 on the Y. That means whenever it instantiates, it's going to start at the player's position, but it's going to go over to the left 3, and then it's going to go up just a little bit on the Y, right? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that this prefab has a 0 on the X and a 0 on the Y, okay? Okay, perfect. So now that should work. Let's test it again. Okay, so now when I hit space, notice that the blob pops up right where my character is, and I can instantiate as many of these prefabs as I like. And, you know, we can set in like parameters that say, hey, you have to wait a certain amount of milliseconds or whatever before you can instantiate another version, so that there's kind of like a, because really there's no, I could just tap it as many times as I want and create as many prefabs as I want, right? So we can put in some kind of a time mechanism if we wanted to. If we really wanted to, we can add a script to this blob that made it travel as soon as it showed up. We can add some script that made it animate whenever it popped in there. We can have it rotating. There's all kinds of things we can do, but that's essentially how you use one game object to create copies of another game object in Unity. This is a skill that we're going to use a couple more times in this class. Just want to play around a little bit more. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Right on. And I have a feeling that we are going to refine this just a little bit. We're going to limit it so that we can't put too many on there. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and just write the start of that code real quick. Let's say if input get key down key code space, and so we're going to use two and signs, and we need a new variable for this. We'll might as well make it a public variable public. We'll say int, and we'll say blob count. Let's set it equal to 5. So we'll say we only have 5 blobs that we can use. And we'll say, and blob count is greater than 0. Then we'll instantiate, and then we will blob count minus minus. What that means is not only are we going to check to see if we've pressed space, but it's also going to check to see if blob count is more than 0. Do we have more? We're basically creating ammunition for our blobs now. So do we have more than 1 or more than 0 blobs that we can use? If we do, it's going to drop a blob, and then it's going to reduce 1 from our blob count, right? So let's go ahead and attach that. And let's see if it actually worked. So give it a minute to update, and let's play. And let's play. Okay. I'm going to make sure I have my ghost object selected here so that I can see my blob count. Notice that it's here. It's 5. Oh, did I pull myself out of play mode on accident? I may have. Or maybe I never went into it. Okay. So blob count is 5. So I can move. Let's drop 1. Now notice my blob count went down to 4, 3, 2, 1. And now I can't drop any more blobs, no matter how many times I press the spacebar, because I've run out of ammunition. Okay, cool. Perfect. That's cool. Now, when we talk about lighting and some other stuff, and probably we might update that when we get into the user interface settings, we'll actually add probably some light around this thing so that it actually does something for us. And then we have to be strategic about how many blobs we're using and where we're putting them. But for now, that functionality works perfectly well. So, yeah, hopefully this worked out for you. Hopefully this wasn't too confusing. And hopefully you learn a little bit more about game objects and how to invoke them whenever you need them, how to instantiate prefabs and make copies so that they're easy to build levels with a lot of objects in them. Okay, cool. Thanks for paying attention, and I will see you next time.